Just less than 2,000 years ago, when the Roman military machine swept into Britain, locals were faced with a choice: resist or collaborate.
That initial post-conquest period must have been a hugely unsettled period and very shocking for people. They would have had contact with Rome before through trade, but that's a very different thing to having a whole legion stationed on your doorstep.
So they don't invade and say you have to worship our gods, but you do have to fall in line, you do have to submit to them.
It's about your ability to speak Latin, to do the particular task that you are there to do.
Over the next few decades, in a series of impressive campaigns, the Romans extended their control over much of the island of Britain. And while Roman sources tell us quite a lot about certain individuals' acts of heroism or resistance, they tend to be quite quiet about what life was actually like for the ordinary people trying to live their lives in the fledgling Roman province of Britannia.
What we're seeing through the archaeology is the elite section of society engaging with the Romans, and we know that through what we see in the burials. We see a huge amount of Roman material culture influencing what people are being buried with.
Now, by utilising new scientific techniques, the team at Colchester Museum are helping to shed light on this tumultuous period in British history.
What's really exciting about the Decoding of the Dead project is that we can look at early Roman Britain.
And also to look into their daily lives through looking at their pathology, their general health and how this may have potentially impacted them on a day-to-day basis.
This will be the first time that we're looking at cremations. Really, it's kind of a gap in our knowledge.
Colchester at this time, which is called Camulodunum by the Iron Age British, it is a complex place, and the British tribes, they're a complex society, and it is mainly through archaeology that we can understand this. The region of Essex, which is sort of tribally is affiliated with the Trinovantes, this is an important seat of power here at Camulodunum. It's incredibly fertile land here, maybe one reason we see this huge farmstead, and that's the best way to describe it. And it's a huge area. It's one of the largest sort of occupied settlements in Britain, and we could call it an oppida, so a centre of power. It's a dispersed site, so we don't see this density of living like the Romans in towns. There's no urbanism like that. We see at Gosbecks, agriculture is taking place. And people are using the land in that sense. That's very different to what we find at Sheepen, another site within Camulodunum, and here we see a lot of industrial activity and commercial activity. So if we look around Camulodunum, we start to see that different spaces, areas, different parts of the settlement are being used in different ways.
The lack of written material means that we are forced to look to the archaeology. Unfortunately, Colchester has got plenty of Roman archaeology. The castle at Colchester was built by William the Conqueror on top of this. This is one of the most important Roman archaeological sites in the UK. And here at Colchester, they have also found plenty of burials.
Cremations did happen in Britain before the Roman period. We always refer to them as a uniquely Roman thing, but we do have Bronze Age cremations, we do have Iron Age cremations in Britain and in the rest of Europe as well.
We see that a lot of the time, not just men, but also women are buried with incredible material culture, so objects. And the closer we get to the point in time of real Roman contact, we see an increase in terms of Roman material culture coming in as well.
Claudius's invasion army was like nothing ever before seen in Britain. It landed in the southeast and swept up through Britain, arrived here in Colchester, and in its wake, there weren't just Roman legionaries fighting soldiers, but all sorts of men and women to provide support. There were craftspeople, there were people to handle the livestock, there were even the families of some of these legionaries. Everything, in short, required to lay the foundations for a Roman imperial settlement in Britain.
When the Romans invade under Claudius, they definitely know that Colchester is the place to go to. They understand that this is the seat of power. They realise that different kings, successive kings, have held power here. So the regions may have changed what they sort of had control over, but Camulodunum and the site here is incredibly important. And indeed, one of the reasons they established the Roman town within this place.
Britain becomes a part of a huge empire that stretches from North Africa to Turkey and beyond, and there are a lot of people that are moving, and they're moving for a variety of reasons. So you have soldiers, so the armies, the different legions are being moved around. You have administrators, so you need governors and you need people who can run the province, and then you have traders and merchants.
When the Romans arrive, they essentially do what they always do, is put down their blueprint for a town. And in some ways, this is a small area. So where modern Colchester is today is where the Roman town was. But within Camulodunum, so Iron Age Colchester, which was a much vaster area, this is a small place to some degree. And they do what they always do. They set up their systems of governance and everything else that is seen through different buildings. And it's a blueprint they use everywhere. When a colony is set up, land is given to retired veteran soldiers, and this is simply taken from the Iron Age Brits of the area, the Trinovantes. And indeed, we see this town and these walls eventually, not at the start, they later build walls around the town, but they really start to encroach on this land. I mean, they need it for all different reasons. One may be for farming, but as I say, also giving over to veterans. And of course, this is where we start to see the discontent of a lot of the Iron Age peoples here.
So part of this process of change includes things that people didn't have a choice over. So you had to pay your taxes, or, obviously you couldn't revolt against the Romans or things like that. But in other ways, I guess people carried on with some of their normal practices and habits. And then gradually they might change. So they might experience new forms of material culture like lamps, or new forms of pottery and new food like olive oil or wine. And then they might adopt those. So there's going to be this very gradual and very organic process of change. But there is always a power difference. There's a power difference between the legionary soldier and a non-citizen in that area.
The relationship of the Romans and how they're trying to politically sort of influence and engage with Britain is quite complicated. So they don't invade and say, you have to worship our gods. It's one interesting way of their diplomacy and how they work, but you do have to fall in line, you do have to submit to them, and they do officially ask for that. And indeed, when Claudius finally arrives in Britain and comes to Colchester, Roman Colchester, or where the town has been set up, the kings or the leaders have to submit to him there. So that means essentially there's a sort of there is a formal relationship with Rome. And those kings and at least the elites, if not the wider population, are benefiting from that relationship.
By this time, the Roman Empire was huge, stretching from Western Europe over here through Central and Eastern Europe, the Middle East and North Africa. It was a huge political and trading superpower. Travel within this space was easy, and it was a common occurrence.
We know that they travelled even to go and see places and monuments, so they travelled for leisure. And we know that obviously the army moved around a lot, and that we had slaves who moved unintentionally.
So there was a lot of mobility in that sense compared to other periods. The road network was relatively good, sea travel was relatively safe, so we can see that there was a lot of movement.
As Colchester began to be transformed in the 50s AD into a site of permanent Roman settlement, we start to learn more about the individuals at that time through personal items that we discovered, or really importantly, their graves.
Burying the dead, sort of Roman funerals, is big business. There's a large population here, and people want to be buried in certain ways, and they certainly want to be buried in a Roman way. We have evidence, as elsewhere in Britain at this time, that in the late Iron Age, people are being cremated, and although this has been around for a long time, It is a Roman imported custom.
The Romans brought with it all this ritual, and the way of doing it was quite sort of prescribed and very specific to the Romans.
It's important to say it's how that cremation is undertaken.
Cremation in the past would have been a really laborious and quite taxing practice. It would have required a hell of a lot of fuel. You would have had to have really ideal conditions on the day, sufficient oxygen flow, the avoidance of rain. It was something that was really quite difficult to do and took a long time to sort of master and perfect.
A cremation is such a visual thing, and especially, cremations could have taken place at night. You can imagine these huge fires, the smoke being put out. And it's a two-stage thing, I suppose. So you can burn the body, and there would be a ceremony around that, and then taking that body, or at least a sample of it, and putting it in, say, a vessel, normally ceramic, but could be other things, and placing it in the ground. So that sequence of cremation, that ceremony and that ritual is certainly a Roman import. Putting a body in the ground or burning someone, those practices have been around for a long time. But here in Iron Age, Essex and Colchester, that's what we're seeing, a Roman imported burial custom.
Generations of archaeologists have been finding pots containing the cremated remains of people from this Roman period for decades. Now, they've been regarded with interest, but there's never been any way of analysing what was in those pots until now. Cutting-edge scientific methods are now enabling archaeologists to open up those pots and learn more about the people whose remains lie inside them. The project's called Decoding the Dead.
Cremation rites were the predominant burial rite for large parts of British prehistory, but we don't actually know that much information about it because they weren't considered to be a strong source of archaeological information. So quite often they've been overlooked and they haven't been utilised. But actually what they can tell us is a lot of information about a burial rite that was really important that we've never been able to establish before. And what makes them so special is that you can use them to reconstruct an entire funerary sequence. So you can use them to establish the building of the pyre, the deposition within the grave, and reconstructing aspects of ancient life and these ancient societies that we weren't previously aware of.
The museum has an amazing collection of cremation vessels, some still with the cremated remains, and in well over 100 years these have just not been analysed, they just haven't been looked at.
The idea is that we have all these new scientific approaches that we haven't had before that can be applied to cremations, and we've brought together specialists from all these different fields.
As the osteologist, my job is to analyse all the bone that has been excavated and try and identify and reconstruct the lives of these people. When lots of people think of cremations, they think of ashes and dust, but actually this is a 20th century concept. In modern crematoriums, they use a pounder to actually grind the bones down. But in the past, what you would have had left over is quite a large amount of fragmented human remains that we can then analyse.
Through this combination of bone and isotope analysis, the team are hoping to find out much more about the people who settled and died in Britain's first Roman colony, and potentially change what we know about some of the earliest Roman settlers in Britain.
An essential part of this project is the isotope analysis. Basically, in the early part of our development, our bones get specific markers based on the climate and geology around us, things like the water you drink or the food that you eat. And what we can do is from these specific bones, and in this project we're looking at strontium isotopes, we can look at these isotope signatures and we can determine the climate of where that person grew up. So we might say this person clearly grew up in a much warmer climate than the British climate. So to find these isotopes, it's only specific bones in the body that have them. So it's either in the teeth or in the petrous bone, which is a bone in the skull located by the ear. And in cremations, you can only really use petrous bones because they're quite big and bulky.
One of the exciting things about this project is that we can also look not just at the isotopes, which tell you about geographical origin, but also the overall health of that individual and their age and their sex. So it's quite interesting to work out whether, if we spot an immigrant, for example, is that individual male or female? So in the past, we may have thought mainly men move into a new province because they're soldiers or merchants, but actually women could have travelled with them or children could have travelled with them. getting all that osteological information as well as the isotope information is really helpful.
In the Decoding the Dead project, we have 36 burials that we've been looking at in detail. And the reason why we chose these burials is because they represented quite a diverse range of individuals, not only specific to the bones, but also to the ceramic pots and finds that they were buried with. So because we were unable to look at every single individual within the population, we wanted to extract a really representative sample. Amongst these human remains, there could be potentially multiple individuals within one pot. So even though there's 36 burials, there could be more individuals in total. Of the 35 individuals that I've identified so far, 6 of them are female and 12 of them are male and 21 of them are unidentified. So the interesting thing about this information is that in cremation analysis there is a tendency to sex individuals as females because of bone shrinkage. Quite often you would presume that an individual may be potentially female because the bones aren't as robust. But as we're seeing here at Roman Colchester, actually, we have more males than we do females. And with regards to age, we've got quite a diverse group of individuals at Roman Colchester. 23 of them have been identified as 18 years and over. 7 of them have been identified as 40 years and over, and then 9 of them have been identified as less than 13 years of age. Even though we have the majority of individuals have been aged at 18 years and over, this doesn't necessarily mean the community was made up of mostly adults. It just means that they're easier to identify from the bones that we have, and they have a better state of preservation. So quite often we do find that younger individuals and those who are from 0 to 13 years of age often are invisible within the archaeological records, specifically with cremations, just because their bone is so fragile, they don't tend to survive as well. I've identified 2 individuals who have porotic hyperostosis, and this manifests as pitting within the cranial fragments and is associated with nutritional deficiencies, so potentially an insufficient diet, or maybe even the individuals were quite unhealthy. So what this might mean is that these individuals had an insufficient diet, or potentially that they generally weren't particularly healthy people. Another individual I've identified from Roman Colchester has something called ankylosing spondylitis, and this is a joint disease that affects the spine. And how it manifests is essentially extra bone growth that stops the vertebral bodies from moving and actually joins them together. Now, this individual would have found it quite difficult to perform everyday tasks because essentially their mobility and their flexibility would have been significantly reduced. It's quite easy to assume that individuals who have pathology were potentially of quite low social standing because they were quite unwell and they weren't as fit as other people within the community. But what we have to understand is that in order for pathology to manifest within the skeleton, that individual would have had to have it for quite a number of years. So what we could potentially argue is that that individual was potentially of high social standing because they lived for so long with this condition, because they were cared for and potentially received treatment.
Bone analysis has told us a little bit about who these people were. Now I've come to visit the team at Colchester Museum to find out more about the latest results of the isotope analysis. Hi guys, how are you doing?
Hi, Dan.
Hello.
Thanks for the exhibition. Just opened?
Just opened? Yep. Let's have a look.
Let's have a look. We had all this human material for decades, but we've never really been able to do much with it. Is this like your generation can finally go, right, let's decode this stuff?
Well, I suppose what's special about the project here with Colchester Museums and the University of Reading is that we're exploring the antiquarian collections of the museum. So these things were dug up, in some cases, over 100 years ago, and they've been very carefully cared for that time. But it's applying that new eye, it's new techniques come along, I suppose new interest, and we suddenly saw this opportunity to really investigate and say something about early Roman Britain.
So incredibly exciting. It sort of justifies us hoarding everything, doesn't it, and saving everything. It goes from being bits of smashed and burnt bone to being essential research material.
It's exactly that, we do never know. And what's interesting is this is application of science, archaeological science, and as most people know, science is always evolving. And it is fantastic we have these. So what we don't have is archaeological context. So any modern excavation would record that, where these things have come from in the ground, the relationship. So we don't have that, but these bones still have something to say. And modern osteologists, modern scientists can extract these hidden stories.
Carolina, what stories did you extract from these bones? I'm so excited about this.
So it's all kinds of different information. So the osteology, like Glyn is referring to, is basically, when you look at a Roman cremation, as you can see, it doesn't look anything like what you expect a cremation to look like. It's not ash, it's actually bone fragments.
And that's good news for you.
That is great news for us, because what it allows us to do is osteologists can identify, well, they can look at identifiable bits of bone fragments, and they can actually work out occasionally what the biological sex of the individual is, what their age is, sometimes even different kinds of pathologies, so diseases that they might have lived with. And then if a particular bone survives, the petrous bone, we can actually now do isotope analysis, which basically lets us know where that individual spent the early part of their years, and gives us an idea of migration and movement in the Roman world.
That's so cool. Where is the petrous?
So it's,
Where's my petrous? Here.
well, it's right by your ear, so it's on the skull, and you've got two. So if we're lucky enough that even one of them survives in the cremation, and it's actually quite exciting because it's the first time we've ever done this with Roman cremation. So isotope analysis to inhumations has been done before, and certainly to Roman inhumations, which, as I mentioned, are later in date generally, to look at migration patterns, and really interesting results have come from that. The issue with cremations is that the firing of the bone actually impacts those isotopes. So the ones that we would normally use to determine migration, oxygen and lead isotopes, we can't use in cremations, but we can use strontium isotopes. And that has been done to cremations before, but sort of prehistoric cremations in Britain, where the movement is localized to Britain, but it's never been done to Roman cremations, where we're really looking at movement on a scale completely not seen before that.
Right, it's so exciting because Britain, for the first time, is part of a transnational empire stretching all the way from the Middle East, Syria, and even beyond, right up to Carlisle.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do get evidence for that. So of all the cremations that we examined, about 25% of them seem to not have come from Colchester.
Right. Okay, so this is the big news, the big headline grabbing news. Mm. What did you find?
Well, it's interesting. Carolina says that 25% of these individuals that we studied in our sample were not from Colchester, Essex, or Britain. In some ways, is that the big headline? Well, it's great, it's really interesting, but that's what we should have expected. We know Colchester is this centre in the really early Roman period in Roman Britain. We know there's this movement. We know the military, for instance, move huge numbers of people. So in a way, it's good that our evidence wasn't contrary to that. We have a face pot here, which is very, very interesting. So these are quite unusual cremation vessels. This chap is quite early in date, so he's sort of later 1st century AD, and just to, you'll know about this, but of course Boudicca came to Colchester, the rebellion burnt the town, so it's just a little bit later than that, or around the same period. So this is a cremation vessel, but they turn up a lot in Germany, and they are associated with the military. So, just looking at this object, we would suggest, maybe there's a chap inside here, and maybe they were a soldier. And what's particularly interesting about studying this cremation is that they were identified as a male, and they actually originated from Italy. So studying their isotopes, so the petrous bone, the isotope analysis, we know that they're from maybe the region of Italy. So that's really, really interesting, and it supports that narrative.
It's also interesting looking at that 25% and, of course, the 75% that are local to Colchester, because they really range. So Glyn was talking about these face pots, and he's absolutely right. But we looked at petrous bones of other individuals in face pots, and they were actually local. So it just shows this blending of people who are coming from abroad and settling in Colchester, and the locals doing a lot of the similar things. And of the examples that we have here, actually 2 of them are not local, which would be the face pot and this local greyware vessel. So actually this person, or one of the individuals here, there's actually 3 individuals here, was not from Colchester, but they are being buried in a kind of very local pot. And then these 2 at the bottom, in this glass vessel and this lead vessel, those are 2 of the most expensive kinds of cremation vessel or urn that you could have, and they're actually local. So it's these local people adopting this very highly Romanized burial tradition very early on, as Glyn says, but it's also to great expense.
Carolina, it's such an exciting project for so many reasons, but one of the great pleasures must be to take a collection that previous generations of curators and storekeepers have thought were basically pretty worthless, and breathing life into them. You've given these people a bit of humanity back.
Yeah, it was one of the most important parts of the project, and I think it's very easy when you go to a museum and you see an inhumation or a skeleton, you can immediately associate with them as a human and an individual and a person. But you know, it's a lot more of a struggle when you've got a cremation and you can't see a face. And that was really what we were trying to do. And we talked a lot about how the Romans have this tradition. The way they deal with death is that they mourn and they remember their ancestors a lot throughout their lifetime, and part of it is telling their stories and keeping them alive through memory, and in a sort of odd kind of way. That's what we were trying to do with this exhibition, was keeping that memory alive and telling the stories of our ancestors in Colchester in the best way that we can, which is through science.
What's so exciting is these bones aren't going anywhere. So what are you going to be able to come back? Your descendants will come back and look at these bones, and what might we one day be able to tell from them?
Absolutely. I mean, in 100 years of them being stored, we can now tell you, from how old they were to if they had a back pain that they struggled with, their general sort of stature and their sex and where they come from. So, who knows in 20 years and what we'll be able to say. And that's why it's so important to keep these collections, and really what this project was about.
And the project really has looked at a fairly small sample, although we were very careful to make sure it was broad in what it picked up. So you'll see here we've got all different types of vessels to try and see if there was correlation between expense in a funerary urn and how that cremation was undertaken and who they were. But it's a small sample, and there are many more in the museum's collections, and we hope now to further the study and actually bring in what I was talking about, some excavated sort of modern excavations of cremation, so we can compare and contrast and even go further afield around Colchester and to rural sites, so we can compare urban and rural and see again, are there different practices going on? Are these people less or more Roman? What's going on there? So I think there's huge mileage in this to really get under the skin and into the bone of these individuals.
That sounds like a really interesting expansion of the project. Looking forward to seeing how that one goes.
Excellent, thanks.
Thank you.
Archaeology is showing us that for many Britons, certainly here in Colchester and around it, the years following the Roman invasion was a time of, well, if not welcoming it, accepting it. And you see British people starting to use the material culture, the objects, the food, the trade goods of this new vast empire they've been incorporated into. What's really interesting about this project at Colchester Museum is it shows us how British and Roman cultural and religious ideas start to become fused together, certainly around burial practice. Does this perhaps mean that Romans and Britons were becoming one decades earlier than we might previously have thought? The work done by these archaeologists and osteologists is ongoing, and I'm absolutely certain that I'll be back here in the years to come to find out more.